There is a particular kind of trust that exists between a healer and a patient in an isolated community that has no physician within reasonable reach. It is not the provisional transactional trust of a modern medical encounter. It is the total trust of a person in genuine suffering who has no other option. You are sick, you cannot afford the doctor in town, or the doctor will not come this far, or the weather has closed the road and you are running out of time. There is a woman in the next hollow who knows what grows on the north face of the ridge and what it does and how much of it crosses the line from remedy into something else. You go to her, you take what she gives you trust her completely, because the alternative is to not trust her and suffer the consequences of that choice alone. This is the condition that a woman named Nora Fain occupied for nearly 20 years in a community in Breathitt County, Kentucky. She was trusted completely. She was trusted by people who had no other choice, and for most of those 20 years, the trust appeared to be warranted. Her patients recovered, her remedies worked, and her position in the community was one of genuine and earned respect. But somewhere in the middle of those 20 years, something changed, or something that had always been present became visible. And by the time the Breathitt County authorities had occasion to look at what Nora Fain had actually been doing, the question of when the change had occurred, or whether it had ever occurred at all, was one they could not answer. Drop your location in the comments before we continue, because what the investigation of 1908 established about Nora Fain's practice and what it could not establish is the most disturbing part of this record, and you need to be present for it. Breathitt County, Kentucky sits in the heart of the eastern Kentucky coalfields, in terrain that the locals have always called rough country, not with complaint, but with the particular pride of people who have learned to live in a landscape that does not accommodate softness. The county seat of Jackson was a functioning small town by the early 20th century, with a courthouse and a newspaper and a rail connection that had arrived in the 1890s. But the outer hollows of Breathitt County, the narrow drainage systems that ran back into the mountains away from the main river valleys, were places where the 20th century arrived slowly and partially. A family living 4 miles up a creek hollow in 1900 lived, in most practical respects, as their grandparents had lived. They grew what they ate, they built what they needed, they tended their sick with what the mountain provided and what knowledge had been passed down to them. And when that knowledge was insufficient, they went to whoever in the community was understood to know more. Nora Fain was understood to know more. She had been understood to know more since the early 1880s, when she first established herself in the community along a tributary of the Middle Fork of the Kentucky River in the northern section of the county. She was at that point in her mid-30s, a woman who had grown up in a family that practiced the traditional plant medicine of the region, had learned from her mother and grandmother, and had developed, over years, a reputation for competence that drew people to her from a radius of several hollow communities. She was not a fraud. This is the important thing to establish at the outset of her story because it shapes everything that follows. Nora Fain genuinely knew what she was doing. The remedies she made worked, the people she treated recovered. Her knowledge of the medicinal plants of the eastern Kentucky mountains was, by the account of a physician from Jackson who examined her case materials in 1908, more extensive and more accurate than he would have expected from any self-trained practitioner he had encountered. She treated fever, infection, digestive ailment, respiratory illness, the injuries of people who worked in conditions that produced injuries regularly and could not stop working for the time it took to heal properly. She delivered children, though she always said she preferred to leave that work to others. She made poultices and tinctures and dried preparations that she kept in a storage room at the back of her house, organized with a precision that Dr. Yates, the Jackson physician who later reviewed them, described as more systematic than the dispensary of the nearest apothecary. She had, by a conservative estimate based on the community inquiry of 1908, seen several hundred patients over the 2 decades of her active practice. The overwhelming majority of them recovered. A number of them recovered from conditions that, without her intervention, would likely have been fatal. She saved lives. This is documented in the testimony of the people who gave accounts to the Breathitt County investigators with the same clarity and consistency as everything else. What is also documented, with the same clarity and consistency, is a pattern that nobody in the community had discussed openly until an investigator from Jackson named Deputy Sheriff Amos Combs began asking questions in the spring of 1908. The pattern was this. Among the patients who had come to Nora Fain for treatment over the years, a subset had disappeared. Not immediately after their treatment, the disappearances were not clustered in time, and they were not all connected by the same presenting illness. They were connected by other things. They were In every case that Deputy Combs was able to document individuals who lived alone or in very small households. They were individuals whose connection to the broader community was thin, no close family in the area, no employer who kept regular account of them, no church attendance that would have generated notice when they stopped appearing. They were individuals who, when they failed to appear in the community, could be explained by a range of ordinary possibilities. They had moved on. They had gone to family in another county. They had simply removed themselves from a community they had been loosely attached to. The first person to disappear this way could be explained. The second could be explained. The third was where the explanation began to strain, and the strain had been accumulating quietly for years before anyone said anything. Deputy Combs began his inquiry in April of 1908, following a report filed by a man named Wallace Stamper, a timber buyer from Jackson who had been making regular trips into the northern Breathitt County hollows for several years and who had noticed in the course of those trips that certain people he had come to know in the community had stopped being present in it. He had made inquiries within the community and had been told, in each case, that the person had moved on or could not be accounted for. He had filed his report with the Breathitt County Sheriff's Office, not because he had evidence of any crime, but because the accumulation of absences had reached a number. He cited 6 names in his report that he could not explain to his own satisfaction with the available explanations. Combs's investigation lasted from April through October of 1908. His case notes, preserved in the Breathitt County Circuit Court records in Jackson, are the most complete document of what was found. They are also, in the judgment of any reader who spends time with them, documents of a man who understood very clearly what he was looking at and was equally clear that he was going to have significant difficulty proving it in any formal proceeding. He was a methodical investigator by the account of his colleagues, a man who had handled the practical violence of eastern Kentucky feuds and company disputes and the ordinary criminal record of a mountain county without losing his capacity for systematic observation. The Fain case was the one his family later said had followed him home in a way that other cases had not. He interviewed Nora Fain twice. She was 60 years old in 1908, and she met both interviews with a composure that Combs described in his case notes as the composure of a woman who had been thinking about this conversation for a long time and had prepared for it accordingly. She was not hostile. She was cooperative in the specific sense of answering every question that was asked of her completely and without evasion, and in doing so, she gave him nothing he had not already known from other sources. She confirmed that she had treated the individuals Combs named. She expressed appropriate concern about their disappearances. She offered the same explanations that the community had offered, that people moved on, that isolated individuals were difficult to track, that she could not be responsible for what became of her patients after they left her care. Combs noted in his case notes that her answers were not wrong. He noted that the question of what she had given the patients in question and what effect it had produced, and what had happened in the period between their treatment and their disappearance, was a question he could not answer through the evidence available to him. He noted that the physician from Jackson who had reviewed her materials, the same physician who had acknowledged her knowledge as genuine, had also noted that some of what she possessed in her preparation stores was material whose medicinal application depended entirely on the quantity used. He noted that this was true of many things in plant medicine, and that the distinction between a remedy and its opposite was often a matter of degree. He noted that he could not establish from the physical evidence that Nora Fain had administered anything to any patient in a quantity that was intended to produce harm rather than healing. He found one thing in the investigation that he could not explain and could not fit into any framework he had available. Among Nora Fain's papers, she kept meticulous records of her patients, their presenting conditions, and their treatments, which was itself unusual for a practitioner of her kind in that era. He found a ledger in which certain entries were marked differently from others. Most entries were straightforward: name, date, condition, treatment provided, but a subset of entries, approximately 20, by Combs's count, had an additional notation that appeared at the end of the standard record. The notation was a single word. The word was not a medical term. It was not a word that had any obvious connection to the patient's condition or treatment. The word was the same in every marked entry. Combs recorded the word in his case notes and then wrote immediately following it, "I do not know what this means. I do not believe she will tell me." He asked her about the notation in their second interview. She said it was a record of a particular outcome she tracked in her practice, an outcome she described as complete resolution. She said it was her highest category of outcome, reserved for patients who achieved a state of health so thorough that they no longer required any further intervention. Combs noted that this was an explanation, He noted that it was not the only possible explanation for the fact that every patient whose entry carried the notation had subsequently disappeared from the community. The word he recorded and declined to include in the official report for reasons he did not explain was settled. The formal inquiry produced no charges. Combs's official report, filed with the Breathitt County Circuit Court in November of 1908, concluded that the disappearances of the individuals named in Wallace Stamper's initial report could not be attributed to any specific cause and that no actionable evidence of criminal conduct had been identified. The report recommended continued attention to any new disappearances in the community. It made no further recommendation with respect to Nora Fain. It was, in every formal sense, a closed matter. Combs signed it and filed it, and, by his family's account, did not speak about it voluntarily for the remainder of his career. She continued to practice for 4 more years after the inquiry. She died in 1912 of an illness she treated herself at the age of 64. She left no family in the county. The ledger of patient records was not found among her effects when a neighbor organized the contents of her house. After her death, it was never recovered. The physician from Jackson who had reviewed her materials in 1908, a man named Dr. Clarence Yates, kept a private journal throughout his career that his family donated to the University of Kentucky's Special Collections in 1967. His entry from the period of the Fain investigation is the most extended entry in the journal's first decade. He wrote about Nora Fain's knowledge with genuine respect. He wrote about the material in her preparation stores with careful clinical detail. At the end of the entry, in a passage that is separate from the clinical observations and written in a different quality of prose, he wrote about what he thought had happened in that hollow over 20 years. He wrote that the line between healing and its opposite is not always where the practitioner places it. He wrote that a person with thorough knowledge of what the mountain provides, thorough enough to heal effectively, thorough enough to be trusted completely, also possesses by necessity the knowledge of what the same materials do in other quantities and combinations. He wrote that the trust of an isolated community is the most powerful thing that a healer in that community holds. And he wrote that he had come away from his review of Nora Fain's materials unsure whether what she had done for 20 years was one thing that became another thing over time, or whether it had always been both things simultaneously, administered to different patients according to a logic that only she had access to. He wrote that what the word settled meant, in the entries where it appeared, was not something he could prove. He wrote that he believed he knew. He wrote that he had chosen not to say so in any official capacity because what he believed could not be proven, and because saying it officially without proof would only destroy what remained of a community's ability to trust the people it depended on. He closed the entry with a sentence that his family, in a note appended to the donated journal, said he had also been heard to say aloud on at least one occasion in the years that followed, in the manner of a man who had never fully put a question down, "The mountain provides. It is only the human hand that decides what it provides, and to whom, and for what purpose." Today, the community along the Middle Fork tributary in Breathitt County, Kentucky, where Nora Fain practiced for 20 years, is a quiet place that has changed significantly in the century since her death. The families who were there in 1900 are represented now by grandchildren and great-grandchildren, some of whom still live in the county, and some of whom have scattered in the way that Appalachian communities scattered across the 20th century. The hollow does not have a marker for Nora Fain's house, which is long gone, the foundation absorbed now into the growth of the hillside above the creek. The cemetery where she was buried sits on a south-facing slope above the drainage, accessible by a path that requires knowing where to look. It has a stone for her, a plain limestone marker, name and dates, no epitaph. The stone is in good condition for its age. Someone has kept it clear of the encroaching vegetation, though the County Historical Society has no record of any arrangement for its maintenance, and the Fain family, as far as the record shows, did not survive into the area. No one has claimed her grave, but someone tends it. Here is what this case asks you to reckon with. Nora Fain healed people for 20 years. This is documented and undeniable. She also, by the weight of the available evidence, did something else to a subset of those people, something that the investigation could not prove and the official record declined to name. The two things were not separate practices conducted separately. They were conducted through the same hands, with the same knowledge in the same hollow, by the same woman who was trusted completely because she had earned that trust genuinely. The healing was real, the trust was real, and inside that real trust something else operated. Was Nora Fain a healer who became something darker over the years as the isolation and the power and the completeness of the community's dependence on her reshaped what she was willing to do with what she knew? Or did she always know exactly what she was doing, selecting, from the beginning, both those she would heal and those for whom settling was the outcome she had in mind. Drop that in the comments, because those two possibilities describe two very different kinds of darkness, and both of them lived in the same hollow for 20 years without anyone saying a word. If these are the stories that stay with you, the ones where the trust was real and what lived inside it was not, subscribe and ring the bell. The hollows keep their healers' secrets well. We are going to keep looking. The mountain provides. The question is always what and for whom and in what quantity.